this next part is something that I did on the podcast every week, and it's something that I did on TikToks sparingly. I will try to make that a more regular thing this year, but it is, and I struggled coming up with the name for it. So last year, I called it the bad fantasy team that was actually good, the bad fantasy team that could have been yours, or could have beat yours. And I think that implied that this was an actual team, and I didn't want to do that. And so, to be perfectly honest, I put the summary of the segment into ChatGPT. It's like, hey, can you just give me a segment name? And it came up with 20. And as with ChatGPT, about 15 of them were weird and awful. But one worked. And that one was the Fantasy Dumpster Darlings, the best unexpected performances of the week. So each week, to prove that fantasy football can be a cruel, cruel mistress, I go through and see the top scores from the least amount of owned players and put them together to show that even if you had 100% of the best plays and the best players in your lineup, sometimes you just run into a juggernaut. And so here is the Fantasy Football Dumpster Darlings, the best unexpected performances of Week 1. He's in the waiver wire column for a reason. It's Baker Mayfield at 35% owned, 29.66 fantasy points for those 35% that had him probably on their bench. At running back, Alexander Madison, sounds like a character from Hamilton, playing for the Vegas Raiders behind Zamir White. The Vegas Raider offense, not great. Madison, pretty good. For the 4% of people who owned him, he had 14.2 fantasy points. Jamal Williams with the New Orleans Saints, again, 4% owned, 11.6 fantasy points. At wide receiver, we all knew Alan Lazard was going to be amazing, right? We just knew that. And so it's surprising that he was 3% owned, but he puts up 23.9 fantasy points. At our wide receiver 2, Alec Pierce, 3% owned, 20 fantasy points. Our tight end, obviously, it's Isaiah Likely. 29% owned, 21.6 fantasy points. Our flex for the Fantasy Dumpster Darling team this week was Brandon Cooks, 33% owned, 12.5 fantasy points. On defense, they were again a pickup for the week. It is the LA Chargers, 14% owned, 14 fantasy points, and the one that really put us over the edge. The number one scoring kicker in the week was Chris Boswell, 6% owned, 26 fantasy points. This gives us a total for a team where Baker Mayfield was the most owned player, 173 fantasy points. Gross.